Order, please. Before we begin the day routine, I recognize the honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to introduce some very welcome guests that are here with us today in your gallery. We have Lloyd Snellgrove, the MLA for Vermilion-Lloydminster in Alberta, and his wife Bev, and Len Mitzel, MLA for Cypress Medicine Hat, Alberta, and his wife June. I would ask that they rise and receive the warm welcome of the House.
Certainly welcome our special guests here at the gallery today and your families. We hope you enjoy the proceedings. Look forward to seeing you here in Nova Scotia. Thank you. Begin the day routine presenting reading petitions. Presenting reports of committees. Tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. Statements by ministers. Government notice of motion. The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Halifax Herald is one of only 2 Nova Scotia businesses to be named to the list of Canada's top 100 employers by MediaCorp Canada Incorporated, with the other being our very own Keynes Canada. Whereas the Chronicle Herald, along with the Sunday Herald, remains Canada's largest independently owned newspaper, and whereas in tabulating the list published by Maclean's magazine, the recruitment histories of more than 55,000 employers from across Canada were examined to find the fastest growing employers nationwide, while also inviting 7,500 employers to complete a detailed review of their human resources practices. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate both the Halifax Herald Limited and Keynes Canada Limited for their outstanding success and for being 2 of Canada's top 100 employers. I respectfully request waiver of notice.
Question for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Tourism, Culture and Heritage.
Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas this weekend, the Cape Breton University Swiss Chalet Capers won the Canadian Intercollegiate Baseball Association Championship. Whereas the team, which also played host to the championship, took the title by edging out the York Lions 1-0 in Sunday's game at the Susan McCackern Memorial Ball Field in Sydney. And whereas the win was thanks to the pitching skills of Tim Burns, who was named MVP, the teamwork of the Capers team members, and the leadership of Coach Nick Bonner. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this legislature applaud the efforts of the Cape Breton University Swiss Chalet Capers, who not only put their team on the map, but also gave the university great exposure nationally at the same time. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice of passage without debate.
Question for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas researchers at the Canadian Centre for Fur Animal Research at the Nova Scotia Agricultural College have developed a feeding guide to help mink producers plan, manufacture, and evaluate diets made from food industry waste and byproducts. And whereas this guide will reduce production costs of feed, which represents the largest variable cost in mink production. And whereas last year the mink industry generated in excess of $38 million in export revenue in Nova Scotia. Therefore, be it resolved that this House acknowledge the significant contribution of the mink researchers at NSAC in the area of byproduct-based feed manufacturing. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Question for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Peter Williams, a physics professor at Acadia University, received a Distinguished Teacher Award from the Association of Atlantic Universities, and whereas Stephen Coughlin, a law professor at Dalhousie University, received a Distinguished Teacher Award from the Association of Atlantic Universities. Whereas these professors are but 2 examples of the superior caliber of Nova Scotia's university educators, which helps draw students from around the world to our campuses. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the legislature congratulate Professor Williams and Professor Coughlin on their accomplishments and recognize that the high quality of teaching is an important factor in making Nova Scotian universities among the world's best. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Question for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas this week, October 24th through 28th, is Canadian Patient Safety Week and the first Canadian week of its kind, and whereas Nova Scotia has led the entire country in a number of areas, including hosting the first 3 Canadian symposiums on safety and having the first medical school to incorporate safety into their curriculum. And whereas Nova Scotia, like other Canadian provinces, have established a provincial healthcare safety advisory committee to be chaired by Dr. Pat Korskery of Capital Health. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House recognize October 24th to 28th as Canadian Patient Safety Week, and thank Dr. Korskery and the Provincial Healthcare Safety Advisory Committee for their commitment and dedication to meet the health care needs of all Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, I seek waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Waivers are agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Tourism, Culture and Heritage.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Where it was with great sadness on October 10th, 2005, Nova Scotia lost one of its cultural icons, Madame Elizabeth Lafort of Cheticamp, at the age of 91. And whereas Madame Lafort's talents were recognized worldwide for her beautiful hooked rugs, which can be found hanging in places like the Vatican, Buckingham Palace, and the White House. And whereas her magnificent portraits and other major tapestries earned Madame Lafort such honors as an honorary doctorate from l'Université de Moncton, the Order of Canada, and the very distinguished title as Canada's Artist in Wool. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House extend their condolences to the Lafort family and also to the people of Cheticamp, St. Joseph-de-Moin, and Marguerite, while expressing admiration for Madame Lafort's immeasurable contribution in the field of Acadian culture. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Waivers are agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I would ask leave to revert to the order of business.
Please. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
I'd like to ask the unanimous leave of the House to revert to the order of business, tabling reports, regulations, and other papers.
No. Don't have unanimous consent. Is it agreed? Table reports, regulations, and other papers.
Mr. Speaker, in my capacity as Attorney General and pursuant to Section 51 of the Judicature Act, I hereby table amendments to the civil procedure rules that were made pursuant to the Judicature Act by the judges of the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal on the 3rd day of June 2005.
Report is tabled. Any further ministerial or statements by Government knows the motion. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas breastfeeding is proven to be the safest and healthiest way to care for a new baby, with numerous benefits to both child and mother, and whereas a new joint Department of Health and Nova Scotia Health Promotion policy has recently been announced, stating that the government is renewing its efforts to support breastfeeding mothers and families, and whereas the Mi'kmaq Child Development Centre in Halifax has one of the highest rates of breastfeeding initiation and duration in the province because of the tremendous support from mothers at the centre. Therefore, be it resolved that it is crucial for the Nova Scotian community to come together to provide support and encouragement for mothers and families in their choice of breastfeeding their children. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. Introduction of bills. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Provide Insurance Protection for Emergency Responders.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Provide Insurance Protection for Emergency Responders.
Bill 262, entitled An Act to Provide Insurance Protection for Emergency Responders.
Or this bill be read a second time to future date. The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour is from passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce an act entitled An Act to Make Communities and Neighborhoods Safer.
The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour is from passage begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Make Communities and Neighborhoods Safer.
Bill 263, entitled An Act to Make Communities and Neighborhoods Safer.
Or this bill be read a second time at a future date. The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce an act entitled to amend Chapter 371 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Public Highways Act.
The honourable member for Kings West begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 371 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Public Highways Act.
Bill 264, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 371 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Public Highways Act.
Or this bill be read a second time at a future date. The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill, an act to amend Chapter 10 of the Acts of 1994-95, the Workers' Compensation Act.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 10 of the Acts of 1995-94, the Workers' Compensation Act.
Bill 265, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 10 of the Acts of 1994-95, the Workers' Compensation Act.
Or this bill be read a second time at a future date. Notice of motion. The honourable leader of the official opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the United States government has proposed that by 2008, passports will be required for travelers entering or leaving that country, regardless of a traveler's citizenship. And whereas the Eastern Regional Conference of the Council of State Governments has joined many other government leaders on both sides of the Canada-U.S. border in opposing this requirement, and whereas tourism operators and other businesses in the United States and Canada are convinced that imposing this requirement on American and Canadian citizens will be a needless economic blow, therefore be it resolved that this House urges redoubled efforts in cooperation with the tourism industry to convince the United States that it should not require passports for American and Canadian citizens to enter and leave the United States. And, Mr. Speaker, I would request waiver and passage without debate.
Waiver disagreed. All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Kings West.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in this year of the veteran, Canadians are paying honour to servicemen and women, their sacrifice and duty to our country. It was at a ceremony at the Greenwood Aviation Museum on October 6 the life and military career of Commanding Officer Roland West was honoured. His skill and determination on the hazardous sorties led to receiving the Distinguished Flying Cross. Whereas Mr. West also received the Air Force Cross for executing many hazardous mercy flights and searches over the Atlantic. On receiving the McKee Trophy awarded for outstanding achievement in the field of aerospace operations, it was noted in the citation that his devotion to duty was of the highest standard. His personal courage merit the highest praise and was always an inspiration to all his associates in the RCAF. Whereas Roland was inducted into Canada's Aviation Hall of Fame with the following citation, the unselfish dedication of his outstanding aeronautical skills to the perfecting of new techniques for search and rescue operations has been of outstanding benefit to Canadian aviation. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the legislature extend to his family, the military community, and all Canadians the recognition of Ron West as pilot, crew commander, and a good person who is a real Canadian hero. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the train station inn, a popular North Shore business, has been recognized in a prestigious international magazine, and whereas Jimmy LaFrenz and his train station inn were the topic of a feature this summer, 6 pages in length in an edition of Man of All Seasons magazine, published in the Netherlands, and whereas the story also included 13 pictures of various parts of the inn and cabooses. Therefore, be it resolved, MLAs in this House of Assembly commend Jimmy LaFrenz, owner of the train station inn, for providing first-class service while marketing northern Nova Scotia as a prime tourist location. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This notice of motion falls under the category any game worth playing is worth playing badly. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the MLA for Timberley Prospect, an old football player with a love for the game that he played in university, and whereas the MLA for Timberley Prospect was recognized at the first annual Sir John A. Macdonald School Flames football auction with the presentation of a helmet for his work to make football a reality at Sir John A. And whereas the new Flames football helmet will now replace his old leather helmet that he previously used as the captain of the Mount Allison Mounties. Therefore, be it resolved that the Nova Scotia Legislature congratulate Bill Estabrooks, the MLA for Timberley Prospect, for his contributions to the Sir John A. football program. I guess, could I have a waiver of notice and passage without...
Waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Nova Scotia Sport Hall of Fame has been honouring athletes and teams who have made outstanding contributions to Nova Scotia's sport heritage and culture since 1980, and whereas that tradition continued when Neil Amadeo, John Cassidy, Susan Smith, Jackie Hayden, Murray Sleep, Al Hollingsworth, David Weber, John Paris Jr., the 1984 Antigonish Robertson's Midget Baseball Team, and 1987 Nova Scotia Canada Games Men's Basketball Team were honoured at the 2005 Nova Scotia Sport Hall of Fame inductees. And whereas in holding these annual events, the Nova Scotia Sport Hall of Fame continues its commitment to the sport history and athletic achievements of Nova Scotia. Therefore, be it resolved, all members of this House congratulate the Nova Scotia Sport Hall of Fame and the 10 inductees on this momentous occasion. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Colchester Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the federal government continues to insist on shortchanging the provinces on their share of national highway infrastructure money, and whereas a national coalition consisting of the Canadian Trucking Alliance, the Tourism Industry Association of Canada, the Canadian Bus Association, the Association of Consulting Engineers of Canada, and the Canadian Construction Association are fed up with the go-slow approach of Ottawa, where they take $6 billion in fuel taxes every year from Canada, but put back only $445 million. And whereas no better example exists than right here in Nova Scotia, where Ottawa recently backed down on a 2003 promise and refused to cost share 50-50 on the twinning of Highway 101 between Eller's House and Davenport. Therefore, be it resolved that all MLAs in this House of Assembly, realizing Ottawa takes nearly $350 million in gas taxes out of Nova Scotia annually, while returning only $130 million, demand through this resolution appropriate funding of the Canada National Highway System here in Nova Scotia.
Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on Friday, September the 23rd, I marched with other concerned citizens organized by HCAP, Halifax Coalition Against Poverty, to bring attention to the issue of housing and homelessness in this province. And whereas a recent HRM survey of homeless individuals showed that 35% of respondents cited housing-related reasons such as lack of affordable housing, eviction, fire, or unsafe premises as their immediate cause of homelessness. And whereas even though on the same day of this march, our own Minister of Community Services, David Morris, and the Federal Housing Minister met at White Point, at the end of the day, they offered nothing more than sympathy. Therefore, be it resolved that the Conservative Government of Nova Scotia stop shedding crocodile tears and actually use the provincial share of the Affordable Housing Agreement to build new affordable housing instead of lining the pockets of private developers. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver and passage without debate.
Waiver here. Several noes. Noes is tabled. The honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Halifax Herald Limited has been named as Canada's top 100 employers. Whereas the Halifax Herald Limited is the nation's largest independently owned newspaper, publishing the Chronicle Herald and the Sunday Herald. Whereas this is the second year in a row that the Halifax Herald has made the top 100 employers list. Therefore, be resolved, the members of this House of Assembly congratulate the management and staff of the Halifax Herald Limited on this important recognition. I'd ask for waiver.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Guysborough Sheet Harbour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Whitman Wharf House Bed and Breakfast opened in Canso on May 22nd, right next door to the Whitman House Museum, and whereas owner Elizabeth Measures, originally from England, is pleased with the response she's received from the community since she opened the bed and breakfast, and whereas Elizabeth Measures says the support and encouragement she received from friends Bill and Gloria Weathers of the Canso Rose Restaurant and Tom Cavanaugh for helping her prepare a Birding in Canso package have helped her develop her business and clientele. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Elizabeth Weathers on the opening of the Whitman Wharf House Bed and Breakfast, and we wish her continued success. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Countermanded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Atlantic.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Leslie Armstrong of Purcell's Cove and Anka Fox have between them more than 40 years of experience studying and teaching weaving around the world, and whereas Armstrong Fox is a newly formed textile company producing luxurious materials on an industrial loom once used to make Harris tweed in Scotland, and whereas Armstrong Fox now sells its alpaca, merino, silk, and woolen goods across North America, therefore be it resolved that this House congratulate Armstrong Fox on this new venture and its role in further expanding the international market for prestigious Nova Scotia crafts. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Countermanded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas October 24th to 30th has been designated as Healthy Workplace Week, with the objective of being to increase awareness about the importance of workplace health to personnel and organizational performance. And whereas the people of Nova Scotia work hard and deserve a healthy environment to conduct their work. And whereas this year, the coordinators of Canada's Healthy Workplace Week...
Please. The honourable member for Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And whereas this year, the coordinators of Canada's Healthy Workplace Week have chosen to focus on ideas surrounding the enhancement of personal well-being, therefore, be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly recognize Healthy Workplace Week so that we may benefit from this event by applying healthy attitudes and ideas to our workplace. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Countermanded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas a new community policing office is now up and running in Mill Cove, and whereas the office is located on lands owned by Mill Cove Developments, formerly CFS Mill Cove, and is the third such office opened in the area served by the Chester RCMP in the past 4 years, with previous offices having been opened in New Ross and at the Forest Heights Community School. And whereas citizens from the local area are invited to drop into the new Mill Cove office at any time during the 4 to 6 hours it is staffed each week, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House recognize the dedication of our community volunteers in wanting to work with local law enforcement officers in Chester St. Margaret's. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Countermanded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas this month, Shiretown Nursing Home celebrates 30 years of service to the seniors and families of Pictou and surrounding communities, and whereas the focus of Shiretown has always been quality care for the 89 residents and is provided by a caring and professional staff, and whereas 27 Shiretown Nursing Home employees recently received long service awards, including staff members Brenda Chisholm and Kathy Henderson, who have been there since the home opened in 1975. Therefore, be it resolved that this Nova Scotia Legislature congratulate the management and staff of Shiretown Nursing Home for their dedication and care to the seniors of Pictou County over the past 3 decades, and wish them continued success in the years to come. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Countermanded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the fourth Monday in October is designated as International School Library Day, and whereas this year's theme, Discover the Adventure, encourages students to visit their school libraries and increase literacy, and whereas school libraries in Nova Scotia play a key role in education and require more dedicated government support to update collections and ensure professional staffing, Therefore, be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly recognize October 24th as International School Library Day and congratulate the many staff and volunteers who work tirelessly in our school libraries to improve student literacy and learning. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Question for waiver, is it agreed? Here and no. Notice is tabled. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Government of Nova Scotia has recently introduced a draft food and nutrition policy for use in provincial schools, and whereas Parkview Education Centre recognized the benefit of offering more nutritional foods to their students prior to the introduction of this policy and have made many changes to the food choices available to students. And whereas as a result of their forward thinking, Parkview Education Centre has been able to meet approximately 80% of the policy recommendations, much to the benefit of the students. Therefore, be resolved that all members of the House commend Parkview Education Centre for their commitment to improving the health and nutrition of its students. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Question for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Contrary minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Timberley Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the communities of Terrence Bay and Lower Prospect have repeatedly brought the condition of their road to the government, whereas sections of this road have deteriorated to such an extent that grass is now growing in the cracked asphalt, and whereas these residents want the road upgraded from Whites Lake through to the Government Wharf in Lower Prospect, therefore be it resolved that the Department of Transportation and Public Works commit to ensure this road receives an upgrade and new pavement.
Notice is tabled. The Honourable Member for Victoria Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Keene Canada has been named as one of Canada's top 100 employers, and whereas Keene Canada established operations in Canada in 1997 and has enjoyed steady growth in the IT sector ever since, and whereas Keene Canada's operation in Halifax employs many talented Nova Scotians, therefore be it resolved that members of this House of Assembly congratulate the management and staff of Keene Canada on their listing as one of Canada's top 100 employers. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver and passage without debate.
Question for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Contrary minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas adults with disabilities in Nova Scotia receive little or no assistance from government to purchase necessary technical aids such as walkers, wheelchairs, and lifts, and whereas persons with disabilities who don't have private insurance are often forced to rely on community fundraising and charity to get their medical necessary assistive devices. And whereas other provinces such as Saskatchewan and Manitoba have programs that offer wheelchairs, hospital beds, and other special needs equipment on a permanent loan program for a nominal fee, therefore be it resolved that this government explore options to implement an assistive device program in Nova Scotia so that no person with an illness or disability has to rely on charity to provide an equipment they need to remain independent and healthy. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Question for waiver? Here no. Notice is tabled. The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Mr. Speaker, if I could make an introduction first, please. I'd like to draw the attention of the House to the West Gallery, where Paula Lunn, the Liberal candidate in Hants West, is here with 4 students representing Canada World Youth who are working in the Windsor area, 2 at the Community Hospital and 2 at the Canadian Cancer Society. And they are Patrick Foucault from Quebec, Alexia Clark from Ontario, William Muller, and Mariam Malta Martins from Brazil. And I'd like for them to rise and have the House give them a warm welcome.
Certainly welcome our special guests to the gallery today and hope they enjoy the proceedings. The Honourable Member for Kings West on the resolution.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Minister of Natural Resources and his department have overlooked the small provincial parks across Nova Scotia, and whereas Claremont Park and many others have not had their water supplies repaired or replaced, and policy is being put in place to use the water strategy as a rationalization, and whereas these small provincial parks need greater attention to meet water upkeep and policing surveillance, therefore be it resolved the Minister of Natural Resources investigate the Claremont Park needs as well as the other parks across the province. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Waiver is agreed. There are several noes. The notice is tabled. Now a member for Cape Breton Nova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on October 22, 2005, at the Royal Canadian Legion in Pleasantville, Newfoundland, the 33rd Annual Newfoundland and Labrador Sports Hall of Fame dinner and induction ceremonies took place. And whereas Mr. Fred Jackson, a national softball coach and multi-sports administrator of the St. John's, Newfoundland, now residing in Sydney, Nova Scotia, will be inducted into the Builder category. And whereas his accomplishments include being the first Newfoundlander to win Canada's Coach of the Year award, he coached 9 national championships, compiling a record of 60 wins and 23 losses. He won 5 medals, achieved a 4th place finish at the 1989 Canada Summer Games, coaching teams to 21 provincial championships and winning a championship in every minor and junior softball category. Therefore, be it resolved that this host congratulate Fred Jackson for his many years of service to the softball community and on his introduction into the Newfoundland and Labrador Sports Hall of Fame. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Waivers are agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax, Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas October 23rd to 29th is observed as National Pap Test Awareness Week, and whereas this vital part of cancer prevention and early detection can prevent up to 90% of all deaths from cervical cancer and help detect other forms of this disease, and whereas Cancer Care Nova Scotia has worked tirelessly to inform and educate women, helping them to understand the risks and how to prevent such an illness, therefore be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly recognize the tremendous work performed by our health professionals and acknowledge their efforts to avert this disease in all forms. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Why, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Harborview School Breakfast Program has celebrated its 10th year of providing breakfast to children before attending school, and whereas during the 10 years more than 62,210 nutritional meals have been served, and whereas the breakfast program is a wonderful example of a community and volunteers coming together to take care of a need, therefore be it resolved that the Nova Scotia Legislative Assembly congratulate Doris Warnell, program founder of the Harborview School Breakfast Program, for its success. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Minister of Natural Resources fumed last week that all Nova Scotia parents are responsible parents after feigning righteous indignation over a suggestion that parents depend on government to regulate unsafe practices by children. And whereas the Minister of Natural Resources, a parent who must know young people can run afoul of their parents' wishes despite even the most responsible upbringing. And whereas the Minister of Natural Resources needs to remember that whether it is a young person who drives an ATV recklessly or one who commits an act of violence in a school, young people are not always under the control of their parents. Therefore, be it resolved, the members of this House urge the Minister of Natural Resources to remember what it means to be a parent, a minister, and do the right thing for our greatest natural resource, our children. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request waiver. Here's several noes. Notice table. The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Canada Games provides a positive environment that offers fulfillment, cultivates new friendship, and fosters leadership through development in sport, and whereas the competitive sports brings out the best in athletic achievement, both individually or working together as a team. And whereas in this competitive environment of athletics, success is achieved through a passion and commitment to the sport, and Russell Todd proved this by winning the bronze as a member of the men's rugby team. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the Nova Scotia Legislative Assembly show their appreciation to Russell Todd's outstanding athletic performance on behalf of Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton Nova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas from September 26 to October 2nd, 2005, the Whitney Pier Society of the Arts celebrated its 8th annual Pierscape. And whereas this week-long festival celebrates the cultural richness that the community of Whitney Pier has to offer through the arts, including visual arts, music, and workshops and storytelling. And whereas this year featured artist was Mary Duganzik, who began painting at the age of 15, painting historically nostalgic and scenic objects, as well as being an active member of the Cape Breton Artists Association. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the Legislative Assembly congratulate the Whitney Pier Society of the Arts on its 8th annual Pierscape and acknowledge Mary Duganzik as her contributions to the art community. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. Order, please. The resolution read by the honourable member for Glace Bay. I'm ruling that out of order. It's unparliamentary. The honourable member for Timberley Prospect. Order, please. Order, please. The honourable member for Timberley Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll be asking for waiver and passage without debate. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas hockey is a passion for Canadians, and whereas the Bay Ducks, playing out of the expanded St. Margaret's Centre, are the newest entry in the Nova Scotia Junior B Hockey League, and whereas head coach Brian Cashin and team president Tim Hill have played important roles in the establishment of this team, therefore be it resolved that the Nova Scotia Legislature congratulate the Bay Ducks, coaching staff, players, and fans of the Ducks in their inaugural season with best wishes of good luck on and off the ice. Mr. Speaker, I ask for a waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waivers, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. Orders of the day, government business. Just before we go to orders of the day, the Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia Municipal Relations, on a what? Point of order?
Mr. Speaker, on Friday the 21st, the member from Dartmouth North tabled a resolution with a whereas clause, and I'll read it. Whereas during the 2005 budget debates, the minister responsible for the Residential Tenancy Act stated, in quotes, there will be no changes to the Act under my watch, but the department will do an internal review of the Act, end quote. Mr. Speaker, I pulled the transcription from debates in the subcommittee. I wasn't able to find that quote anywhere within the debates. And what I would say, Mr. Speaker, is if I could provide you with both this and the transcription of the subcommittee, that you would rule and request the member to withdraw his resolution.
All member Cole Harbour from passage.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the member opposite for giving me a chance to speak on this. I will say this, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of our caucus, two things. First of all, I think this is a dispute between two members. Second of all, the motion's already been found in order. That's why it was tabled. It's there on the Hansard. If there was an opportunity to raise it, that was the time to raise it. That was when he should have done it. He can't do it now, and frankly, this is a dispute between two members.
Any further interventions? We'll take the matter under advisement. The government business, the Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Yes,
business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Government business, public bills for second reading.
Public bills for second reading.
Mr. Speaker, I call Bill number 251, the Public Service Act.
Bill number 251, Public Service Act. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
I'd move second reading of the bill.
The Honourable Member of Cole Harbour from passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to speak briefly on this bill for the record. This is a change in the rules with regard to who can attend Internal Economy Board meetings from the government benches. They have 5 members. And as a result, Mr. Speaker, this is a bill that we think is a good piece of legislation that will allow the government to have some flexibility in who it appoints. Does not affect the appointment of other members, but will allow some flexibility on the government benches.
Now, Member of Cape Breton South.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I agree with the House Leader of the NDP in this regard, and certainly it's a bill that cleans up a problem that the government have had, and we're in favor of sending this on to law amendments and see if it generates any interest there, and then back to the House.
Recognize the Honourable Minister Justice to close debate on Bill number 251. The Honourable Minister.
I appreciate the intervention of the honourable members. I would point out, though, that the provision actually amends the provision for members for all three caucuses. No, Mr. Speaker. It's may choose a member of the caucus to substitute for a member of the board. So I think it's a member of the caucus. Anyway, we can refer the matter to law amendments, but I would point that out to the members of the committee. With that, I'd move second reading.
Motion is for second reading of Bill number 251. House ready for the question? All those in favor say aye. Contrary minded, nay. Motion is carried.
Bill 251, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 376 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Public Service Act.
This bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I call Bill number 256, the Municipal Government Act.
Bill number 256, the Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to open debate on Bill number 256, the Municipal Government Act. This is a straightforward bill. The Municipal Government Act is the Bible for municipal administration in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, my department receives requests either individually from municipalities or through the Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities on a regular basis for amendments to this Act. It is important that the Act be amended regularly to ensure it continues meeting the needs of municipalities. For this reason, responding to requests from municipalities to amend the Act is virtually an annual occurrence. Probably the most noteworthy feature of this bill is a clause that will enable Halifax Regional Municipality to acquire vacant boarded-up buildings if they have been boarded up longer than a municipal bylaw would allow. This authority was requested by HRM and HRM only. Other municipalities did not ask for it. For this reason, this authority will only apply to HRM. If other members question why this authority is not extended to all municipalities, the answer is they did not ask for it. The other changes are mostly housekeeping. They include allowing for electronically filing of deed transfer tax information, enabling municipalities to borrow funds needed to demolish municipally owned buildings, and amending provisions within the Act so that they are more closely matched the words of the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. As I said, Mr. Speaker, this is a straightforward piece of legislation, and I look forward to comments from other members. Thank you.
Recognize the member from Halifax Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising to address this bill as the NDP caucus's municipal relations critic. What the minister said about amendments to the Municipal Government Act being a fairly regular occurrence certainly is true. The good thing about this is that it is done in a process of full collaboration with the Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities, and we've now reached the point where it is rare or non-existent for amendments of this kind to come forward without the knowledge and support of the UNSM. As the minister says, though, the most interesting feature of the bill is the one that was requested specifically by the Halifax Regional Municipality, which I want to address briefly. There's two important things to say about this, Mr. Speaker. First of all, what it does is it allows HRM and HRM only, no other one of the 54 municipalities in Nova Scotia, allows only HRM to expropriate boarded-up buildings. Now, this is an issue which you could refer to as urban blight, but although I don't think that boarded-up buildings are something that's unique to the inner city of Halifax. But the conundrum that the municipality faces is what to do with a building that's dragging a neighborhood down, which may attract undesirable elements, which looks terrible, brings everybody else's values down, attracts undesirable elements. What do you do if the owner is not willing to do anything about it? And so the HRM has come forward and said, well, please give us this legislative power where, with appropriate safeguards, we can actually expropriate the building, fix it at fair market value, and then we decide what to do with it, rather than having the owner decide what to do with it. The owner does get a certain amount of notice, so presumably this is not something that would be abused by the city, although certainly it would be very public if it were abused by the city. But my two thoughts on it, Mr. Speaker, are this. First thought is maybe it doesn't go far enough. These are buildings that, this will apply to buildings kind of at the extreme end of the spectrum, buildings that have already been abandoned, buildings that have already been boarded up. I think the legislation says for 6 months. There's a whole range of other very, very problematic buildings in my constituency, in most of the other members' constituencies, where they're not quite that far down the road, but they're equally difficult. And I'm thinking of one, actually two in particular in my constituency, where they have become the fulcrum around which the descent of a neighborhood turns. And I know the Minister of Community Services knows at least one neighborhood that I'm talking about for reasons that he's well aware of. But there's another one in a completely different part of my constituency. They are bad buildings, bad owners attracting bad tenants, and it drags the whole neighborhood down with them. And the neighbors come to their politicians, their elected representatives, especially their city councillor, but also their MLA, and say, do something about this. And the city is pretty much helpless because they don't have the powers they need to do anything constructive about it. There's a dangerous and unsightly premises bylaw, but it's not enough, because these buildings are kept up to the absolute bare minimum standard, and sometimes not even that, but just the bare minimum standard. And Mr. Speaker, to meet the minimum standard of the dangerous and unsightly premises bylaw, the building doesn't have to be in very good shape, believe me. Or you can keep getting the landlord for bylaw violations of one kind or another, and they drag their feet on cleaning up their properties, but eventually they do it, and meanwhile it continues to be a blight on the neighborhood. And I would say to the minister, after discussion in our caucus, we support this provision. We think it's a good idea, but let me plant this seed with the minister's Department of Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations. Maybe this provision, if anything, doesn't go far enough. So that's the first thought on that part of the bill, Mr. Speaker. The second thought is this. The municipal relations critic for the Liberal Party and myself received a very helpful briefing from the minister's staff, and they gave us the documentation from the Halifax Regional Municipality that backs up their request. But the difficulty is that the legislation that's been brought forward doesn't match HRM's request. And so the question is, it's a legitimate question, and for all I know, there's a good answer to this. What does HRM think about the bill that's actually been brought forward? Presumably, they know about it, and presumably they support the change in the wording, but it's not what they asked for. It's something different from what they asked for. Now, I understand that after this letter to the minister from the mayor was written on August 17, 2005, there were continuing discussions between the minister's department and the city of Halifax, or the Halifax Regional Municipality. But I think the point is that for this legislature, who's now being asked to pass a bill based on what HRM has asked for, what does HRM think about the bill as actually presented? If the minister has something in writing saying that HRM is aware of what the bill says and supports it, that's fine. I'd invite the minister to bring that forward. But the information that I was given, the information that I have, says that HRM asked for one thing and the department is delivering another, and I'm not quite clear on the reason for the difference. So maybe today, maybe in his speech closing second reading, or maybe at some other time, the minister could clarify that point as well. Other than that, on this bill, our caucus is satisfied that these are housekeeping matters, all of which have been thoroughly vetted with the UNSM, and we're pleased to support them on second reading. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Recognized honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm happy to rise today to talk a little bit about Bill 256, which is an amendment to the Municipal Government Act. Again, it is worth noting that the departmental staff gave us a very helpful briefing last week, myself and the NDP critic for municipal affairs, explaining some of the background to this and going over the individual clauses. And that certainly was very helpful, and we appreciate that time. I myself was a city councillor just a few years ago and had sat on the Dangerous and Unsightly Premises Committee, and at that time it had come up on a number of occasions that we looked at boarded up buildings that were completely demoralizing to the areas and the neighborhoods in which they were, and yet there was nothing that committee could do about it, provided they were safely boarded, and really no time limit whatsoever existed. And I had raised the question myself at that committee as to why this was allowed and why we had no power. So it's very good to see the enabling legislation here that would allow HRM to enact a bylaw and set a time limit that they would consider to be a maximum for a building to be boarded up and unused in the city or within HRM. I do question as well whether this would not be something that other municipalities would have an interest in, although it would push their hand if they had that control, because it means they would then have to or could be called upon to acquire buildings that are, definitely unsightly and demoralizing, and as I say, really devalue a community. However, I think that might be of some interest to other municipalities, and perhaps that discussion will take place, or it may even come to their attention as we pass this through law amendments. But I think it is a very important power to give to HRM, because the issue arises frequently, and I think that the City Council and the Mayor need to have tools and the ability to take action that is beneficial to the whole community. So that certainly, to me, was the most important aspect of this bill. Again, there are some changes to the FOIPOP provisions, which I gather bring it into a more harmonious, similar wording as our Freedom of Information Act, and that makes it easier to use effectively. And at the same time, it makes a couple of other provisions for the electronic filing of deed transfer tax, which doesn't apply to every municipality as I understand it, but a majority of our municipalities do charge a deed transfer tax upon the sale and transfer of properties, and that will now be expedited if it can be done electronically. So this just allows that to happen, in a very in a proper and legal manner. So I think that's very important that be done. We understood that there had been a pilot done which paralleled, so that they did both the new system and the old to ensure that all of the I guess kinks could be worked out of that and it will work well when it is adopted. So with that being said, we look forward to law amendments for this bill and seeing what, if anything, the public has to say. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member Dartmouth North.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it gives me a pleasure to speak on Bill number 256, an act to amend Chapter 18 of the Acts of 1998, the Municipal Government Act. And Mr. Speaker, this is a piece of legislation that I know the district councillor for District 9 in Dartmouth has been working very hard on for a couple of years. This piece of legislation is not new. It's modeled after the Manitoba legislation that allows municipalities the opportunity to address the issue of derelict buildings and boarded up properties and so on. And it's a very important piece of legislation. And I say this providing that the municipality is quick in crafting a bylaw. It's okay for this provincial government to enshrine it within the Municipal Government Act and allow the municipalities to, in fact, or the municipality of HRM to, in fact, craft a bylaw around this. But bylaws must stand the test of time. And as many members who have at least at one time or another served in municipal government, they do know that municipal governments sometimes have a habit of crafting bylaws, and bylaws that simply don't have any teeth. And when they reach the room of the court, they're thrown out simply because they're invalid or don't make statement to the precise issue. So you need to recognize that although this piece of legislation is coming before this legislative assembly, and I don't know if it's the responsibility of the minister responsible for municipal relations or not, since this piece of legislation came through his office, to watch the municipalities and make sure that the municipalities craft legislation by which it will stand the test of time, and that the legal departments might get together on the piece of legislation to make sure that it is a piece of legislation that does precisely that, stand the test of time. I do know, Mr. Speaker, that I had been very fortunate to have the Minister of Housing tour my constituency along with the chairperson of the Neighborhood Watch program. The minister, I referred the minister and took him to a particular site where, in fact, we have a very serious problem around this. It is the Pinecrest, Brule Street, Jackson area. As a matter of fact, the former city of Dartmouth placed a study on this very area simply because there was a real problem identified with respect to the new development that was coming forward on that day of the Highfield development of the Highfield community, where in fact many multi-unit residential developments were taking place. And you know, derelict buildings and properties just simply don't happen by chance. They're a product of bad municipal planning. When municipal government recognizes that in the absence of public participation, and even though there was a lot of public participation around this, recognizes that in the absence of public participation, it is their responsibility to develop healthy communities. That didn't happen. I happened to serve in municipal council at the time when, in fact, the development was coming adjacent to the Pinecrest, Brule Street, Jackson area. And what happened is, because of this new development, people who could afford to move out of that neighborhood filtered themselves out into the new community, leaving the vacant units behind. Eventually, the vacant units, because of their age, some 25 to 40 years of age, just simply got laid by the wayside. Landlords didn't maintain them or keep them up. Therefore, they were unable to be rented or leased to individuals looking for places. And not only that, those people, I should say the individuals whom, in fact, could only afford that kind of shelter, found themselves in that community. And as a result of the filtering effect, what happens is you virtually destroy a community. The minister witnessed it at firsthand, because the minister has seen the number of boarded up buildings in the Pinecrest, Brule Street area. And it was great that the minister was there that day, because the minister, and I must commend him once again, because the very next day, his office had actually called and asked for a list of the number of boarded up buildings in that community. And he also indicated that there might be an opportunity that his department can look at some way of developing or utilizing those facilities or buildings for residential livings. I have to say that this is commendable. I hope that the minister will take us up on that, because we did provide him with the number. In that one area alone, there were approximately 5 boarded up buildings for certain. 5 boarded up buildings. They had lent nothing to the community. Absolutely nothing. They were hangouts for drugs. They were hangout facilities for persons who were scheming to rob buildings and places. They not only did that, but they also taxed the policing services of your municipality, because the police are constantly needed to be there. This piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, in fact, needs to be recognized. Although we will talk about it here in this Legislative Assembly, needs to be recognized that the bylaw that is crafted needs to have the teeth in which to do it. Now, I want to tell you that as a former member of council, the former city of Dartmouth put a $23,000 study on the Pinecrest, Brule Street area, simply because they had recognized that there needed to be a protection of this community. And this community could no longer sustain the multi-unit residential development, that there needed to be a mix or blend of that community. The study, as I have said, it cost some $23,000. It was approved in principle by the former municipal council. However, shortly after came municipal amalgamation. And I'm sure the third party know the consequences of that municipal amalgamation. I want to say that in the Hayward report had indicated all those plans and reports that were available by the former municipalities would be honored and committed by the new regional municipality. that they would be obligated to fulfill the commitments to those plans. Unfortunately, that did not happen at the Halifax Regional Municipality with respect to the Pinecrest Rural Street study. The Halifax Regional Municipality said that it was not their responsibility what a former municipal government had produced, that they were a new municipal government, and that they could not commit the dollars to this particular revitalization of the community. The community was supposed to have $1 million a year for 10 years to revitalize that community. As a matter of fact, that very community, Mr. Speaker, had a special zone placed on it by the then Dartmouth Planning Department. The zone in that particular community was zoned R1M, a most unusual zoning. The R1M meant that it was a residential 1 modified. And the reason why it was modified was to have this community be able to sustain some sensible approach to what is considered healthy communities. It allowed undersized lots to have single-family residential developments built on them. It would have also allowed undersized street networks so that those undersized street networks would in fact reduce the wide streets that are already there. And the planning department, of course, recognized that this was part of the old municipal county of Halifax at the time when in fact they amalgamated, and so therefore some of the street alignments and networks weren't consistent with normal street patterns. So it had to be done. There was a need to address this very issue. Despite my going with the former councillor to the Halifax Regional Municipality, mayor and the CEO, and despite my going with the now present councillor to the mayor and the CEO with respect to putting the dollars in to develop this community and meet its deadlines, and to introduce some pilot projects as recommended by the report, none of that happened. So if I stand here somewhat skeptical about what role the municipal government might play in this, it is because I have experienced some of that skepticism, or some of that, I shouldn't say skepticism, but some of that inaction by the Halifax Regional Municipality. I want to say that for my colleague, for the member of Halifax Regional Council, who represents the district, Councillor Jim Smith, that he has put a tremendous amount of work into bringing this piece of legislation forward. As a matter of fact, it was when he was out on a Canadian Federation of Municipalities conference, and it was out west, that in fact he had consultation with Manitoba and found out that Manitoba has a piece of legislation that simply fits there. There was some problems with the Halifax Regional Municipality adopting the exact legislation as a Manitoba piece of legislation, and rightly so. They were concerned of rather it was workable or doable, or rather it would have the same effect here. For what reason, I don't know, but I must say that a member of the Halifax Planning Department advised me that this was coming forward. Councillor Jim Smith advised me that this piece of legislation was coming forward. And I do want to say to the Minister of Municipal Relations as well, is that the Minister of Municipal Relations was very much aware that this piece of legislation would be coming forward. I think there were future attempts by the Halifax Regional Municipality to communicate with the government on what kind of legislation might be needed, or what kind of language, I should say, might be needed to strengthen this piece of legislation. I can say to the Minister of Municipal Relations that the amendment to the Municipal Government Act is simply the length of which the government finds itself capable of going. My concern is that it's the issue is around the issue, in my opinion, is around crafting the language, once again, Mr. Speaker, of the municipal bylaws. I want to say that to me is the single most important piece of bylaw that can accompany this legislation. It must be a bylaw that's in unison, again without sounding redundant, Mr. Speaker. And I know that during speaks on the bill, you try not to be repetitive, but sometimes it's important to exercise the need for repetitiveness, to enhance the need to craft decent legislation. The 10-year plan was, if I can go back to it, was something that would have addressed the real needs of this community. It would be unfair of me to say that the government hasn't done anything within the Highfield Pinecrest area, because it has. But it has taken the path of least resistance and of least dollars spent. Now, the big argument was that when the amalgamated municipalities came forward, that there was an amalgamation of debts, and there needed to be this debt retirement. And I know there's members on council and former members on council on the government side who served under the new regional municipality. And they had a primary objective to administer financially the affairs of the new Halifax regional municipality in much the same way as the former city of Halifax did. Capital construction and so on would be done by way of debt retirement, and that the overall debt would be reduced to manageable. Because there was this number of 15% of the revenue coming in to be spent on the debt of the municipality was a bit too high, and that they wanted to get down somewhere around 8, 9, 10% of the revenue coming in towards debt retirement. And I commend them for that. But I want to say that in all the reports that had been adopted by the new Halifax regional municipality, this was one of the reports that did not get the full attention it rightfully deserved. It did not get the dollars that were designed and allocated to it. And it was not acknowledged by the new Halifax regional municipality that the former Dartmouth City Council recognized this to be an important revitalization of a community, and that in fact that is the reason why when they hired the consultants to do this report, that those reports had timelines and dollar signs placed to them. We're well beyond that time. As a matter of fact, in 2006 will be the anniversary date of the new Halifax Regional Municipality's 10th year. I think that is fair to say, that I think we went back to 1996, in the fall, December of 1996, when the election of councillors for the new Halifax Regional Municipality. Actually, the fall of 95, and I do apologize. Actually, the fall of this year is actually the 10th year, and the true essence, December the 3rd, yes. Now I'm getting correction. See, that's what happens when you become aged. Sometimes these things slip by on you, and you don't keep them trapped in this gray mush of mine that's up here. And I have to tell you that, you know, it's important to keep these numbers. Keep these numbers very close, and it's important to have you make sure that your memory bank continues to recognize these important things. I do recall earlier that I believe that somebody might have made mention that I erroneously made some mistakes on a resolution. I wouldn't dare bring that into part of this piece of legislation, because I think that that's for another day, and I do know that the Honourable Speaker will rule on that on a future day. But by the same token, since it's a municipal issue and it's a government issue, it's a good thing to have those things reviewed. I want to I want to just simply say this. We talk about how communities develop. And one of the ways communities develop, and they develop in a way that's not beneficial to governments, is they develop because of the neglect of municipal governments. And I say primarily to the planning department. Now, I have a number of issues that are coming forward here in the future with respect to the way the planning department has a vision for the Dartmouth North. As a matter of fact, its overall plan for that vision of Dartmouth North is to continue a deep concentration of multi-unit residential developments, despite the fact that Dartmouth North already has 61% of its residential units into multi-unit residential development. The vision of the future of Halifax is to continue with that density of residential development in Dartmouth North. And their arguments are that it is in close proximity to shopping centers, close proximity to where people work, close proximity to bus shelters, the whole thing. Well, I would say to you that Dartmouth North is not the only constituency that is in close proximity to all these. And I would say to you that you, as municipal planners, plan the kind of communities that exist where, in fact, there is trouble, where, in fact, you find derelict buildings, where, in fact, you find murders, where, in fact, you find prostitution, where, in fact, you find illegal drinking establishments, where, in fact, you find illegal gaming establishments. All of these are a result of planning and not watching communities very closely. And I do know that if representatives of healthy communities from the Canadian Federation of Municipalities came and took a tour of my constituency, much the same as the minister of responsible for housing did, that they would certainly see a neglect that should not have been allowed to happen, and to this very day should not be allowed to exist. As a municipal politician, I certainly made every effort to bring it to the attention of municipal government of the day that this was a wrong practice, and I had thought that we were on the right track. Municipal government of this day, developing its new plan regionally, and as well as having community participation in its new plan, has to recognize that when they develop these kind of communities, the people don't participate. They don't participate in the public participant process because they don't feel ownership to a community. They feel that when they're in those multi-unit developments, for the most part, that they're going to live there for a short time, that they're going to be homeowners, they're going to relocate elsewhere, and that someone else will move in after them. Herein lies a real problem. How do you get that public participation? And what I'm saying is to the municipal planning department, particularly the HRM planning department, that there needs to be some acknowledgement that in fact they have an important role to play. Once again, I want to make emphasis on the fact that municipal governments, particularly the planning department, and municipal councils, by the way, because they do have the authority to approve or disapprove any piece of land use application or development. Although the council, and I want to just step back a bit, although the planning department, in the absence of public participation, needs to recognize their role, municipal councils need to recognize their role as well. In the absence of the planning departments not recognizing the special needs in the community, and just simply because property is deemed to be that which in fact is already has a use, and I forget the term used, that it's as of right development, that's the term. Even though these developments can go on as of right, that there needs to be, by council, a recognition that even though the recommendation might come forward by the planning department to approve a development proposal, that they do have the power to defeat that development proposal if in good conscience they don't believe that development proposal is consistent with community, neighborhood, or planning. They have that right to defeat that. The developer, on the other hand, has the right to go before the URB, the Utilities and Review Board. And the developer can challenge the decision of the council. It can challenge the decision of the planning department. And there are many that have gone before the Utilities and Review Board with respect to development. That therein lies the role of responsibility in both municipal planning departments and in both the role of and also the role of the municipal councils. Fortunately, in this municipality, there's another level of government, believe it or not, within the government itself, and that's called the community council. It has certain powers. That community council has powers within itself to address immediate planning issues, not municipal planning strategy uses, because that's of the whole council. And land uses, that's of the whole council. But they do have the opportunity to debate as of right developments that come before them, and other minor variances of land use, and as, of course, land use in itself in a minor way. I do want to say that I have supposedly probably spoke enough on this piece of legislation until it crosses this legislature and goes into the red room where public participation can take place, although I doubt if much of it will, and then come back into this legislature for third reading and finally for proclamation. I do want to say that I will be awaiting that day for it to come back again. I will hopefully get the opportunity, if need be, to speak once again on that piece of legislation. But I do want the Minister of Municipal Relations to be very much aware that I'll be watching his department in connect with the Halifax Regional Municipality on how this piece of legislation is going to be administered. There had been some talk around, the time frame, some 7 days when takeover by a municipal bylaw, 30 days when takeover, or 60 or 90 days when takeover. Quite frankly, I think if it goes beyond 15 days or 30 days, that we're just playing in the hands of the property owner and the developer. But mind you, there are legal minds, far greater than mine, who will understand the legality of making sure that property owners whose properties are going to be expropriated know full well their rights in legislation. And also the right for those property owners to in fact know how their asset is going to be taken away from them as a result of the municipality engaging in these powers. But I do want to say that this is a piece of legislation that's beyond its time. The province of Manitoba had no difficulty in crafting this piece of legislation. And my understanding of this piece of legislation when it was passed in Manitoba, although I don't believe it was ever used, it certainly was an arm out there that allowed the municipalities the power. And once they seen that the municipalities had that power to enact this bylaw and to make them accountable, that is when all things changed. And it's unfortunate in our society that there are some landlords who need to be pushed down like a nail to the point whereby they have to be held accountable. Unfortunately, that's a fact of life. There's not a whole lot we can do about it. But I do want to say, in closing, Mr. Speaker, that I thank Councillor Smith for his involvement into this piece of legislation. I also thank, despite of my criticisms of the Planning Department, I want to thank the Planning Department of HRM for allowing me to have the opportunity to sit and discuss with them the issues and concerns of Dartmouth North. And finally, I want to thank the Minister of responsible for housing for coming and having a tour of the Dartmouth North constituency and recognizing some of the very real needs that exist in that constituency. Thank you very much.
Now, member for Halifax, Shabukto.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. There are two general points about the Municipal Government Act and municipal legislation that I'd like to talk about before turning to focus on some of the details of what's contained in Bill 256. So the first point is we have to ask ourselves exactly why it is that it's even necessary or desirable for such a bill to come forward. The question really that I raise is why it is that we have to continue to grapple in the legislature with detailed pieces of legislation that tinker with the extent of the powers that municipalities are going to be allowed to exercise. I think the fact that we do find ourselves looking at such legislation on a fairly regular basis indicates a very profound ambiguity of the legal system towards municipalities. And by the legal system here, I mean essentially a partnership of the courts and the legislatures. This has been a feature of life for the legal context of municipalities in Canada for well over 100 years. The question really is whether it's changing and whether it's desirable that it ought to change. Think about what it is that this bill at its core does. In essence, it seeks to give a particular power to deal with properties that are found to be dangerous and unsightly to the municipalities. It essentially says, well, the municipalities, which already have the powers to declare properties to be dangerous and unsightly, and which already have the powers of expropriation, it now seeks to link these two things and say, well, if the property is dangerous and unsightly and has been boarded up for a while, then you can expropriate this property. Just think about that. Why is it that we actually have to go this extra step and pass through this House legislation that makes it clear that this this tiny accretion of power is something that we can recognize as being properly exercisable by a municipality? Now, the answer to that seems to be, and I'm not approving it, I'm just saying it, but the answer to that seems to be that over the years, the attitude of governments in the different provinces around Canada, backed up by various decisions of the courts, has been that, and I think I'm quoting more or less exactly, municipalities are creatures of the province. They have no independent powers. They can only exercise those powers which they have specifically and explicitly been granted by the legislature, or any powers which are reasonably implied by the specific powers that have already been granted to them by the legislation. In other words, municipalities are not seen as exactly like the two senior levels of government. They're not like the federal government. They're not like the provincial government. We know that they're not constitutional entities. They don't have powers that derive from Section 91 or 92 or the other relevant sections of the Constitution Act, which traditionally are interpreted in very broad ways in order to give plenary powers to the senior levels of government. The attitude to municipalities, which nonetheless are a level of government, is quite different. The attitude is summed up in the cases or in the case books, is known in the words that I quoted earlier, is generally known as Dillon's Rule. Dillon was the author of a municipal law textbook in the United States in the late 1800s. And that rule has been, or that observation has been imported into Canadian law through decisions dating back to the 1880s to the early 1900s in Canada. I'll refer you to two leading decisions. One of them, interestingly enough, is a City of Halifax decision that went to the Supreme Court of Canada in 1906 or 1907. The case was called McElwraith versus Hart. And here's what happened. In that case, the mayor of the City of Halifax at the time had attended a meeting of the National Municipal Organization, the predecessor to the FCM, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. And when the mayor came back, he put in a claim for his expenses. And these were challenged in court by a citizen taxpayer who said, the governing statute of the City of Halifax does not say that the expenses of the mayor who attends a national convention on behalf of the city at the behest of City Council can be reimbursed for his expenses. There were lots of other provisions in the Act that talks about reimbursing the councillor and mayor for certain other kinds of expenses. It just didn't happen to mention national meetings of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities or its predecessor. And that argument was successful in the Supreme Court of Canada. What they said was, Dillon's rule applies. If it's not on the list, then you can't charge it up. The municipality was regarded as a trustee of the money of the taxpayers, which is appropriate, but the powers of the municipality to spend that money as trustee were seen as extremely circumscribed. Now, this is a very peculiar state of affairs, although there's an interesting footnote to this. To this day, in the Municipal Government Act, there is a small subsection, I think it's in section 172 of the Act, that actually says that the expenses of the mayor and councillors when they attend meetings of the FCM or equivalent are in fact reimbursable. It's still there. That tiny little clause is still there because of that decision of the Supreme Court of Canada in 1906 or 1907 applying Dillon's rule. Now, there are lots of other cases that did this, but you know what? That's not the modern view. The modern view of the Supreme Court of Canada, as enunciated in such cases as the 2001 decision in Spraytech versus the town of Hudson, is that in fact municipalities should be given some credit, and that when there are clauses in the governing legislation that are generally known as omnibus power clauses, that they should be given an expansive meaning. They should be given real meaning. And an omnibus clause is one that says that a municipality shall have the power to enact bylaws for the health, welfare, safety, and general benefit of its residents. In fact, some provinces have gone farther and they've tried to put in place what are called natural person powers. They've tried to essentially say municipalities are like natural people. They have all the plenary powers, of course, that they would normally have to take civic action. And it's up to them. So what I'm saying is that the courts have evolved, faced with the kinds of legislation that we, the provinces, give to the municipalities. The courts have evolved. 100 years ago and more, they adopted this very narrow, nitpicking, restrictive view known as Dillon's rule, and they confined municipalities to the strict letter of the law. Now, the courts are opening up and they're saying municipalities are a level of government. Give them general powers, let them figure out what they're going to do with it. If you want to restrict their powers in some way, take it away, but the starting point should be an assumption based on these omnibus powers that in fact they have very plenary powers and they should be trusted, and that if there's a problem, you can take powers away, or the voters will decide at the municipal elections that they don't like what it is that the council is doing, and they'll be held accountable. Well, what I'm saying is that our legislation doesn't seem to be of that model. Our basic attitude to the municipalities is, unless we spell it out for you, unless we spell it out in detail, you're not to be trusted. Look at the Municipal Government Act. It's 600 sections long. It's one of the longest pieces of legislation in the books in the province of Nova Scotia. So what the attitude seems to be is profoundly ambiguous. On the one hand, the legislation starts out saying municipalities are wonderful, they're a level of government, they should have the prime responsibility for making decisions about land. But then it goes on to say, in effect, if we don't lay it out for you in minute detail, you don't have the power. Something's got to give. Something should give. I simply don't think it's desirable that year after year we should continue to see bill after bill after bill. And it's not as if it's one bill a year, it's usually several bills a year coming in having to do with tinkering with the powers that municipalities have. Now, I know this is not entirely as simple a question as I've laid it out here, but the overall framework is exactly what I've described. And what I'm saying is the minister should think, his department should think, his officials should think carefully about whether it isn't time for us to reconsider the ways in which the powers of municipalities are configured in Nova Scotia. So that's my first point. Second point is this. Second point is, why on earth is it that we are being invited to pass municipal legislation yet again in which the range of powers being offered to HRM is different than the range of powers being offered to non-HRM municipalities? Now, the minister, in bringing forward the bill for second reading and in recommending it to us, said the answer to that question is the other municipalities didn't ask for it. Well, with all due respect to the honourable minister, Mr. Speaker, I don't find that a convincing reason. They didn't ask for it. That isn't the only basis on which the minister's department or this legislature should decide to set policy, setting the framework for municipal law. They didn't ask for it. Well, the absence of asking for it doesn't tell us whether, in fact, we ought to, as a matter of principle, offer that power to those other municipalities. What about CBRM, for example? Are slums only confined to HRM? We know that this is not the case. Are boarded up buildings only to be found in HRM and not in the Annapolis Valley? That isn't the case. Is it the case that there are dangerous and unsightly premises only in HRM, but not in or near Amherst? Well, you know, how blessed are those other municipalities if that's the case? But we know it isn't the case. The question isn't those municipalities didn't get around to asking for it and HRM did. The question is this a good power that ought to be in the range of powers that the minister's department thinks should be offered to those municipal councils to exercise? Not, they didn't ask for it. That's not a good basis on which to make that decision. If the minister thinks those other municipalities are not to be trusted with this power, then maybe he should say so. If the minister thinks that those other municipalities reject this power and don't like it, and HRM is the only one that is even prepared to consider this possibility, I'd like to hear him say that, and I'd like to see the evidence. There's got to be something somewhat more specific. What I'm saying is that in principle, it's not desirable to bring into being this kind of two-tiered system when it comes to the exercise of these powers. The last time this was done, to my recollection, was when different powers with respect to pesticide control came through this House in 1998 when the Municipal Government Act, I think, was first adopted. Sections 172 versus Section 533 of the Act. I mean, it's very peculiar that we continue to have, within the Municipal Government Act, a whole part that is specifically assigned to delineating how HRM is different from other municipalities in the province. Now, I agree, of course, it's the biggest municipality, it's the most populous municipality, it's an important place, but it's not at all clear to me that the powers, at least the theoretical powers, because all we're doing is setting a framework, should be so significantly different for HRM than they are for other municipalities. Surely there's got to be a somewhat more compelling reason than they didn't ask for it. So again, I ask if there isn't some explanation that can be offered here when we're being invited to support a bill that again treats HRM, Halifax Regional Municipality, as different than the other municipalities in terms of the range of powers that they have. Okay, both of those are preliminary points. It seems to me they're important points that the minister and his department should consider. And yet let's focus now on what it is that the bill in its detail actually does. The municipality, in this case, one municipality, HRM, is about to be given a power to expropriate properties that have been boarded up for a while and as a result of the dangerous and unsightly premises powers. Nothing wrong with that. It's a good idea. And I want to pause for a moment to observe that expropriation is, in fact, in the absence of a negotiated purchase and sale agreement, the right way to go. And indeed, there are, I believe, some councillors at HRM who were on the Dangerous and Unsightly Premises Committee who are of the opinion that the price to be paid by HRM should be less than fair market value. They advocated for that position. I've spoken to some of those councillors. I used to be a member of HRM's Dangerous and Unsightly Premises Committee myself, just like the honourable member for Clayton Park and the honourable minister. And I have to say that I cannot agree, I do not agree with the proposition that these buildings should be acquired at less than fair market value. What would be the rationale for that? Now, I know it's not in the minister's bill, and he seems to have rejected that, but we have to squarely face up to the idea that is out there that indeed the buildings should be acquired not in the normal expropriation process, but through the process at a price less than the price that would be set by the expropriation process, which of course is fair market value for the highest and best use of the land. And as the minister says, plus expenses. I cannot see the compelling rationale. It's certainly the case that when a community has been burdened over the years with dangerous and unsightly premises, buildings that have been allowed to run down, buildings that have in fact become unsightly, become dangerous, become highly problematic, that there's a spin-off, a negative spin-off for the community around them. But this is reflected in the tax system. If those buildings are run down, then presumably their value is less, their assessment will be less, they'll have paid less in the way of taxes, and ultimately, when it's time for expropriation, the municipality will pay less for those buildings, but they won't pay less than fair market value. They'll pay the fair market value, which would reflect the state of deterioration of those buildings. Of course it would reflect the state of deterioration of those buildings. The only basis on which such an argument could be made, I think, is that the municipality can't afford to pay the fair market value and would prefer to pay less. Well, too bad is the answer to that. The municipality is simply going to have to engage in the process. If they decide to pay up to buy those buildings, then they're going to have to just pay whatever the freight is as determined independently or through negotiation. That's the fair way. So I think, although the minister didn't engage with this particular issue, he's right not to have accepted that suggestion, and he's right to have kept it out of the bill. What I think is that what we have to focus on here is what's going to happen next. What happens if the municipality actually does go ahead and acquire such property? In grappling with the situation, the municipalities are already engaging with a very tough problem. I know that in HRM, not really in my constituency, which has been fortunate to have virtually none of these buildings. I can only think of one or two, and they were boarded up really only because of fire, or in a couple of cases specifically because the landlord was determined to run them into the ground in the hopes of being able to persuade the municipality to upzone what could be done on their property. Fortunately, in my own constituency, there's been hardly any of those buildings, but I do know that in the immediately adjacent constituency of, say, the honourable member for Halifax Needham, there are a number of buildings that are highly problematic and a number of neighbourhoods that are highly problematic. I know from my general experience and, of course, from the time on Halifax City Council and on HRM's council. And let's make a distinction here that I think is also fundamental, which is between buildings which are owned by a landlord and those that are owner-occupied. Those buildings that are owner-occupied are sometimes simply run down through the poverty of the owners. That does happen. Sometimes it's not the poverty, sometimes it's the mental illness. I don't know if you've ever experienced this, Mr. Speaker, but I know in my area from time to time, I've run into a couple of people who either through outright mental illness in the prime of their years or through general degeneracy as they get older, are simply not paying attention to their properties, and the properties run down. It's a family problem, it's a problem for the public trustee, it's a problem for the municipality, it's a problem for neighbors. It's one of those things which is isolated, but it comes up, you have to deal with them. But in general, those are owner-occupied properties, and there's usually an interest on the part of the individual or their family in maintaining those buildings and keeping ownership of them, or at least keeping them in good shape so that they can have a valuable asset to pass on to the next generation or for their own family members to live in. The real problem is with buildings that are owned by landlords who have living in them very poor tenants, and they allow those buildings to become very run down indeed. Sometimes they're engaged in land assemblage. Sometimes what they're doing is buying up buildings purposefully to allow them to run down. They allow the building to run down in a process of what's called block busting. What they do is they buy a building in a block, they let it run down. This has a knock-on effect with the surrounding buildings, which become undesirable. The value of those adjoining buildings will go down. The original buyer will then buy those buildings, and they will have now 2 or 3 buildings in the same block or neighborhood, and they will then continue and continue and continue so that they can end up with a land assemblage of a whole block or half a block, so that then they can come along with a larger development and try to persuade the council that it's desirable then to do something. Well, something has to happen in order to offset that dynamic. And the real entity that is in a position to do that, if the province isn't going to, is the municipality. And this is true, as I said earlier, it should be in every municipality that they should have the power to be able to fight back here. And I don't know why we're depriving all the municipalities of the opportunity to fight back here. So, what is the municipality going to do? Are they going to just demolish the buildings once they've acquired them through negotiation or expropriation? Or are they going to rebuild? And if they are going to rebuild, what exactly are they going to rebuild? And at this point, having thought our way through the framework that Bill 256 sets up, we're smack up against where we really ought to be, which is, what's the province's housing policy? What is the province's housing policy? What is it that the province has in place to help municipalities that want to resist the block busting of certain developers, advance the need for good, affordable housing, and not just in HRM, but in all the municipalities of this province? What is the province's policy? And the answer, unfortunately, is they're prepared to spend as few dollars as possible on moderate and affordable housing. So the key question at the back of Bill 256 is, what happens next? What does happen next? Are we going to see a resurgence of slum clearance? Are we going to see some money put on the table to help the cooperatives, for example, that want to get going? Is real advantage going to be taken of the federal provincial schemes that are in place in order to promote better housing in our municipalities? So far, the record has been pretty dismal in Nova Scotia. And the opportunity exists in municipalities all around Nova Scotia to do something good based on the money that the federal government is prepared to cost share with the provinces and municipalities, and once this legal framework is in place, to let them do so. So we'll pass this bill. That's fine. We'll pass 256, Bill 256. Maybe, as a result of the law amendments process, its powers will be seen appropriately to extend to all municipalities so that they can get on with this process. But at least, as offered to us by the Honourable Minister, it will apply in HRM. But the responsibility of the government doesn't end with setting the legal framework. The responsibility of the government is to see to it that there's follow-through. The responsibility of the government is to come up with some money in order to advance affordable housing in this province. So that's going to be the test of this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to talk to it.
Recognize the member for Cape Breton Nova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today on Bill 256, the Municipal Governments Act. I rise on the occasion of wondering if maybe when the minister stands up in his place a little later on, he can tell the members of the legislature, and if he had offered this choice or to the municipalities, other municipalities in the province, specifically the CBRM. I wondered if he discussed this bill with those. I notice in the clause 18 in the bill, it says strictly this is a HRM bill, and I'm a member of the Legislative Assembly from Cape Breton, but I'm just wondering if there was any contact made with the CBRM to discuss any of those, because they have an Unsightly Premises Act also, and there is quite a few buildings. Actually, we had a fire in my community on the weekend from a boarded up building that was torched, and I think they become fire hazards when they're boarded up, and I think that we have somebody that is committing arson, I guess, in the community looking at burning these buildings down. So maybe this bill would be of great use to the CBRM, and they could use this bill to help get rid of the bad buildings and bad owners and slum landlords and those types of things in the community to help. You know, I can go back and think of an incident on Webster Street. I remember this gentleman coming to my home and my house and my office a few times asking about this Unsightly Premises Act, and the building was burnt and then boarded up and then burnt again, I guess, and it was quite close to his house, and they burnt the barn down. So if this act had been offered or in place in the CBRM, it's a possibility that some of the homeowners there wouldn't be calling my office or contacting me about getting rid of some of these things on the unsightly premises. So maybe I would like to, you know, the CBRM, well, again, my colleague from Halifax Citadel had said a two-tier system. You know, Municipal Governments Acts cover, you know, Halifax being the most populated area of the province and everything else. But I think that this act maybe could look at covering the whole of all the municipalities of the province of Nova Scotia, not just a certain area of the HRM. So I'm hoping that when the minister stands up, he could clarify for me and my colleagues here that if the CBRM was ever contacted or the CBRM was ever asked to be a part of this act. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I don't think he knows the word speaker.
Recognize the honourable member for Halifax Atlantic.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to see this come forward, but I am surprised, I must say. I'm surprised by the scope of this bill, or perhaps the narrowness of this bill. It's interesting, as my colleague has pointed out, that yet again we have an instance of the municipal government being specifically tailored to deal with one municipality, albeit the largest, rather than dealing with the phenomenon of municipalities in the province of Nova Scotia. This is rather an unfortunate commentary on the state of the strength of the province, but it's yet one more manifestation. However, having said that, I have some questions, and I would like to ensure that, in fact, these are addressed before such a bill is passed. This is giving some fairly strong powers by defining some circumstances under which expropriation is appropriate. The first question that I have actually is around the type of property which is eligible for expropriation. We see the words vacant, we see the words boarded up, and I hear my colleagues talking about dangerous and unsightly. Those are four very different descriptions, and those are things which do not necessarily overlap. I believe that there are buildings which are boarded up, which are not dangerous. Some, one might argue, are not even unsightly. There are, however, vacant buildings which are not boarded up and should be. And there are, most importantly, buildings which are not boarded up. They are not vacant, but they are certainly dangerous. And this is one of the difficulties that I see with this bill, because if there is an incentive for a if there is in fact an incentive for a landowner to hold on to a property as it runs into the ground and not to find it liable for expropriation, there is also an incentive for the landowner to at least have somebody waving the flag, showing that the property is in some way occupied. And this is where we run into some of the worst failures of the housing department in Nova Scotia. It has been deemed too expensive for the province of Nova Scotia to initiate any sort of a program of regular inspection of commercially rented premises, and premises which are residential but are rented by a landowner who has enough of these properties to deem it a commercial enterprise. It has been said that it is simply too expensive to engage in any kind of an inspection regime, and yet such an inspection regime, it seems to me, would be an important way of safeguarding the lives and health of the inhabitants of some of the buildings which are in fact business enterprises for their landowners. We need to be very careful indeed to distinguish between vacant buildings and abandoned buildings. If landowners have the incentive to keep these buildings somewhat occupied, then there is a real danger for the inhabitants of those buildings. Another caution which I would have concerns the character of the property, including the building. This bill, as I understand it, refers to properties which include boarded up buildings. My question is, how large can such a property be? HRM is a municipality the size of Prince Edward Island, and by no means all of it is an urban core. There are a number of abandoned buildings which stand on very large, very desirable lots of land, or boarded up buildings. And there is some question, I would say, as to whether the package of land should be severed, which includes the boarded up building, whether there should be a forced subdivision of some sort, because does 200 acres become dangerous and unsightly because it includes a small boarded up building? Technically, this could be the case. Some of the buildings which are abandoned would fall into the category of orphan. And the National Roundtable on the Environment and Economy has been very specific about the need to address these so-called orphan properties in the context of brownfields, formerly contaminated properties. Frequently, there are abandoned buildings associated with these. In my own riding, which includes the Herring Cove Road, there are any number of commercial properties which have worn the sign, "Opening soon, such and such a business," for 5, 6, and even 7